Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 141 of the Childless Not by Choice podcast. This is Civilla Morgan. My mission, as many of you know, is to recognize and speak to the childless not by choice women and men around the world, reminding us, that we can live joyful, relevant, fulfilled, childless not by choice lives. Whether you have children or not, thank you for tuning in. Well, what is today's show about? It's about a triathlete's adventures and adversities into the rapids. Yes, you heard me right. I have the great pleasure to interview one Rob Hutchings. He's author of Downriver Nomad, and you're probably wondering, well, what does this have to do with childlessness? But wait, you will find out. So hang in there with us. I want to, just before we get started though, thank my Patreon contributors. I want to thank you all for your monthly contributions to the podcast. You know that your contributions help immensely, and I appreciate all that you do on a monthly basis. So, what does a triathlete have to do with Childless Not by Choice and the platform? Let me tell you. Triathlete and marathon swimmer Rob Hutchings takes us on a whirlwind journey from triathlons and his first marathon swim in his own home country of Canada to Ironman competitions across the pond, then down under to Australia and New Zealand, where he embarked on marathon adventures off the beaten track, on land and in the water, which led to his biggest challenge, an unprecedented attempt at swimming the turbulent 256K Clutha River. In Downriver Nomad, Rob shares his story of adventures and adversities not only in the water, on the race course, and off the beaten track, but also his struggles with an alcoholic father and his own unsuccessful path to fatherhood. His is a story of humor, heartbreak, and challenges that will inspire the absolute beginner in adventure sports to the seasoned endurance athlete. Join Rob on his nomadic adventures in triathlon, marathon swimming, and adventure sports. The book itself packed with hairpin bends, whirlpools, rock dodging, and white water rapids. Rob Hutchings, welcome to the show.
And thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. I did not know how I was going to enjoy this book or like it. I was like, oh my gosh, a sport I don't even know anything about. I've never thought about it. And I'm like, wow, I'm going to read it because I want to be ready to interview someone who's gone through the Childless Not by Choice journey, like many of us. And I absolutely enjoyed the book. I loved it. I'm not just saying it. I read it. I read the whole thing. Downriver Nomad is the name of the book, you guys. It's a triathlete's adventure and adversities in the rapids. There is a link to a lot of his YouTube videos in the show notes, so be sure to check out the different links in there. But I'm going off track already. Let's talk to Rob.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I know it's Sunday in the United States where you are, but down here in New Zealand, we're living in the future. It's already Monday morning.
That is always just amazing to me. I don't know. It's the little things for me, but that to me is just the coolest thing. So it's about 2:45 Sunday afternoon here, which is when I do a lot of my interviews. It's on a Sunday for me. And then I get to talk to people, like you said, in the future. It's already Monday morning and you're going to be getting ready for work soon and all that stuff. It's pretty cool how our planet works.
It is. Fortunately, I don't have to go to work till 11 and it's only 6:45 a.m., so we got plenty of time.
Good. Well, like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed your book and how you were able to combine your infertility journey with your passion for triathlon. It was beautifully done. And I want to just start off like I usually do by jumping in the deep end, no pun intended. Tell us a little bit about the I struggled with using this question or asking this question first, but let's try it and see what happens. Tell us a little bit about the Australian adoption process and how it is the way it is due to the history of the stolen generation.
Yeah, so just for very quickly, backstory that your listeners will probably work out very quickly. I'm not Australian. I'm an Australian citizen because I'm married to an Australian woman. I lived there for 15 years before we both jumped over to New Zealand, where we currently are. So I'm an Australian citizen with a funny accent from Canada, but I met my wife 3 years after I moved to Australia. I met her in 2005. And about a year after we were together, we decided, we're getting married, we're going to have children. That's what I long thought that I would do eventually when I found the right woman, and I definitely did with my wife. About a year after deciding, yes, we're going to try to have children, found out, no, we're not having children the old-fashioned way. So to get into your question, basically the Australian system is all government run, which on one end is not a bad thing because it doesn't have the corruption that can often accompany private adoption agencies. But unfortunately, pretty much every government-run agency, it's a bureaucracy. It takes a very, very long time to get the process done. And the reason it was set up, in my estimation, and I emphasize this is my own estimation, and of course, having come to that conclusion through experience and in talking with friends as well, the stolen generation of the indigenous population of Australia, it didn't fully finish until the 1970s, but the very terrible history of it is that when Australia was being settled, they were trying to assimilate the indigenous population of Australia, and the church groups, unfortunately, they decided the best thing to do was to essentially steal children from their parents and raise them as essentially to try to make them just like white people and Christians. And this was going on for a couple of centuries and right up until the 1970s when they finally legally put a stop to it. What that meant was that there's a very bad stigma about adoption in general in Australia, at least on the government end, and a lot of people have a very poor perception of what adoption means. So, in my estimation, in order to correct a very real societal problem, what they did was well-intentioned, I do believe, but they swung the pendulum too far in the other direction, and what that meant was they made it way too hard to adopt children. So that's my estimation of it.
And as I read about that, I thought, and like you said, they swung the pendulum the complete opposite direction, which to me, a lot like what government does. I mean,
yes,
you'd think they'd find a happy medium somewhere.
This isn't unique to adoption, this sort of problem. In my estimation, if you recognize a legitimate problem, you say, right, we got a big problem. The pendulum swung way too far in one way before they get it right. And I can't say they'll ever get it right in adoption. I don't know in Australia, but they swung the pendulum too far in the other direction. And that's not unique to adoption. In my estimation, on most societal issues, when you recognize a big one, they overcorrect and then hopefully at some point, and it usually takes a very long time, they get it, I won't say right, but better than it was in both directions at some point in the future.
Yeah, I agree totally with that. Totally. So because of the issue with the stolen generation problem in Australia, when you're trying to adopt, Thailand is suggested.
Yes. So Australia was a signature of the Hague Convention, which all countries that had the government-run system, it was the international treaty on adoption. And there was only a certain number of countries that Australia assigned an international adoption agreement with. And for the quick backstory, for one of the reasons we chose overseas adoption is because in Australia, state by state, there's only a handful, less than half a dozen domestic adoptions per year, which meant the wait list was often 10 to 12 years long for domestic adoption. And we can talk about the reasons for why that is later. But for international adoption, it was meant to be about 5 years or so. Australia only had signed an international adoption agreement with several countries. There weren't that many. And each one had strict criteria on who was eligible. And one of the biggest ones was the length of our marriage. That was a big roadblock. Like some countries required you had to be married for at least 7 to 10 years. And at that time, my wife and I, we'd only been married for a year or so. Some had religious requirements, and we didn't formally practice a religion. And there was other little criteria, but we met the criteria for Thailand. And that was, at the time, incidentally, the only country we met all the criteria for. And that's where we started.
Yeah, and then that was harrowing. I mean, the questions they ask, I can't even imagine the stress because I've not been through that. I've tried adoption twice, but as a single person, they just basically blew me off in both instances.
And in the same in Australia, like a single person, man or woman, can't. I'm 99% sure that's still true. But at the time in 2000, and forgive my faulty memory, I think it was 2008 we started, or it might have been 9, we started this process. 2008. Single people could not adopt in Australia.
At all. I mean, no questions asked.
No question.
Unbelievable. And it didn't matter how much money you had, how much income, because at the time I tried to adopt, I was a stockbroker at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they had already told me get an insurance policy. So I had a huge life insurance policy just in case anything happened to me, after I had adopted the child, but none of that mattered.
Yeah, and it would have been the same in Australia as well. And my understanding is in New Zealand, it's a bit better in New Zealand, but I've aged out of the process. I'm now approaching 47 and I've only been in New Zealand 4 years, but we'd come to terms with it before we moved there. But yeah, in Australia, single, you can't adopt. And like I say, Thailand was the only country we were even eligible for consideration based on the length of our marriage at the time.
And 47 seems pretty young to age out, too. I mean, do they even tell you what age range you can adopt?
I think it was the upper end was 46 in Australia, and laws are reasonably similar and this sort of thing in New Zealand. But we haven't looked into it in the 4 years we've lived in New Zealand. We've accepted childless after a long battle. Even if age wasn't a factor, I mean, I couldn't put myself through that process again. It was too much.
Right, definitely. And speaking of that, after things with Thailand didn't work out, then you tried Colombia.
Yes, so we were accepted onto the wait list in Thailand, and we were told it would be anywhere between a year to up to 2 years waiting. And, the process of getting onto that wait list, as I mentioned, the government-run bureaucracy on the Australian end, that took more than 2 years. And you'd think, the social worker visits, health checks, all that stuff, worst case scenario would take several months if you were really committed and getting through it. But no, the hoops you jump through takes so long. So we were finally accepted after very, very, very intrusive social worker visits, etc. I'll describe more about that shortly. But we were accepted onto the wait list, and then we got a letter from the adoption agency. It would have been about a year later, and I opened it with kind of the anticipation of, this might be the letter saying, hey, we're going to get children. And it was a letter saying that Thailand had shut down their inter-country adoption program because of concerns about very legitimate concerns about corruption within the program. And on that note, I mean, I'd always, throughout this whole process, I'd gone back and forth in what I thought was the ethical thing to do about inter-country adoption. Like I thought, is it ethical or is it morally just to, take a child out of their own country and culture and raise them in another? And I always came back to morally justifying it in my mind. It's like, well, there's tens and millions of children out there that need love and family, and my wife and I have a lot of love to give. So that's how I kept coming back to saying, yes, I'm comfortable with this.
But, as I read that in the book, I wondered, when did Thailand know that there was an issue? Did they just find that out? I can't believe that would be the case.
I honestly couldn't tell you how, why it is they brought that up at that time, because if they didn't know before that, something was wrong on their information system. I can't tell you what led to their decision that, yes, this is too corrupt, we got to shut it down. But if they didn't know before, that in itself was a problem. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they just decided it was a problem. Unfortunately, poor timing for us, but that's what happened. We were then told by the adoption agency in Australia, I shouldn't call it an agency, it's a government department. Yeah, no more options because, we weren't eligible for the other several countries like Ethiopia or India or a few of the other countries that there was an inter-adoption to country agreement with. So for almost exactly 2 weeks, my wife and I, Tansy, we were shell-shocked. I always just believed that, as a triathlete, one foot in front of the other, you eventually get to the finish line. And that's how I sort of was going through the adoption process. You'd eventually get there. And for about 2 weeks, we were shell-shocked and just trying to go through the motions of work and everything else, saying, okay, I'm 30-something, this is back in that time, I'm 30-something, I'm not going to have kids. And I never had my full emotional breakdown. Breakdown's the wrong word. I'll just call it a meltdown. And there were a number of them. I mean, I didn't go off the rails or, have to stop work or anything, but it was really tough. But I think that for those 2 weeks, it was numb. I just couldn't believe it. We just out of the blue, and this is, again, purely coincidental timing for us. Out of the blue, we got another call from the adoption agency, or keep calling it agency, it's a department, saying we've literally just signed an agreement. The Australia government had just signed an inter-country adoption agreement with Colombia, and we met the criteria. So you're on again, but you got to go through that whole process of, the social worker visits, and we actually had psychology visits, which previously weren't required for Thailand. And the whole process started from scratch, and we were eligible to adopt from Colombia, and that's what we tried to do.
Yeah, and then those trick questions.
Yeah.
I was like, really? The page 171 for that trick question. Every time I think about the grilling that potential adoptive parents go through, and I think about people who have kids naturally, they go through nothing. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be some type of process or protection of the children when when it's the adoption process, but I just find the whole process extreme. Outside of even any cultural history of abuse like Australia, as we discussed earlier. So how did you make sense of the grilling, of not being believed?
Well, first, for when we initially started, it was a social worker. And I want to be very clear, I have no issue with social workers in general. I just didn't particularly like the particular social worker that we had, in my estimation. And after we later talked to other prospective adoptive parents in Australia who had the same social worker, they all seemed to come to the same opinion that he was on a bit of a power trip. And to his credit, he ultimately gave us a very favorable report. But my estimation was that he recognized that he had power over us and everything we wanted was in his hands, essentially. So there was the whole questioning of my father had gone off the rails when I was a teenager. Problems started before that, but he really went off the rails when I was a teenager. So there's the whole grilling, both from his end and later, again, when we were trying to adopt from Colombia, and also then from a psychologist, which was not previously required from Thailand. So there was the grilling about that. And I expected it. And I don't disagree with the fact that it was, I'll say, necessary. I understood the reasoning why they had to question it. If there's going to be grandparents in the picture and that sort of thing, they want to make sure they're protecting children, that sort of stuff. I like to think I'm reasonably open, about my story. I wrote a book and told it, and, I'm quite very happy to come on this podcast and tell my story. So I like to think I'm reasonably open, but telling a complete stranger who I didn't get a good vibe from because I had to, in order to try to have children, I found, I'll use the word a violation. It was very intrusive.
Off-putting.
Yes, that's a better word, I guess, off-putting. Yeah. And so when it came to the psychology, you mentioned page 171 of my book. I quickly opened it and said, what was page 171? And the multiple choice psychology testing. First, the psychology, I'll just read this. I think it's funny in retrospect, but at the time I was kind of disturbed. But the multiple choice questions were essentially, hundreds and hundreds of ways of asking, are you a wife beater? Are you an alcoholic? Are you a drug addict? Are you likely to commit suicide? And the one particular question that stands out in my mind that just I couldn't believe it was even there was, when you commit suicide, and I emphasize it said when, not if, who would you prefer to find your body? Your spouse, your child, your parents, a friend, or a stranger? And when I came to that question, having already been asked hundreds of different ways, am I likely to commit suicide or suffer depression? I just couldn't believe they asked me when, not if. And I went up to the psychologist's door, and I'd like to think I'm not timid in any way. I don't think I'm timid's away, but I was very timidly knocking on the psychologist's door. I was out in the other room doing this test before my appointment with her, and I just said, look, I can't answer this question. And she told me I had to for the test to be accepted. So I ended up choosing a stranger, which I thought was the least bad option, find my body, according to the question, when I commit suicide. I just couldn't believe that was a question. It blew my mind. And
I was in shock too. I was like, seriously? When? And then you have to answer the question?
Yeah, have to, or it won't be accepted.
Wow. Unbelievable. The things that people who just want what we all would think is normal, want, and the things that we have to go through. And speaking of that, the unsolicited questions and suggestions.
Oh, of course.
Really,
yes.
the craziness of it all. It reminded me of an episode I did. I can't remember the episode number, but I interviewed a woman from Kenya. She is the founder of a group called Waiting Wombs. So slightly different than those of us who have decided that we will not pursue adopting or having or whatever a child. We've come to the conclusion it was not meant to be. She is managing a huge program in Kenya called Waiting Wombs, where many of these women are still hopeful, and that's wonderful. But the reason I bring it up is because she talked about the questions and the unsolicited questions and the crazy suggestions of ways that what things you can do to have a baby.
Oh, absolutely. And just for context, I mean, I'm a chiropractor and very much into natural health. I mean, I don't really like the way some people in the natural health community present themselves, for example, on Instagram. I don't do any of that stuff. I mean, on my social media, the only thing I talk about are, swimming, cycling, and running. Being a triathlete, I don't use it for anything else. But, I already do yoga, and I like to think I eat reasonably well. And, I think I look after my body reasonably well. But when I would come across different people, and tell them what we're going through, it would be like, oh, you didn't know you were talking to someone in network marketing who had a supplement range. It's like, oh, try this supplement that's only available through my amazing network marketing range. And if you take this supplement, you'll have so many babies, you'll have to have a vasectomy. And that wasn't a one-off. That was more than once. Then it was just people really prying in. People would say, oh, well, go to my naturopath or go to this or I mean, I did all that. I didn't need to be told to do all that. I mean, I tried everything. And, being a swimmer, one of the things I did, and also a cyclist, I mean, I'll just explain the back context. I mean, basically, the reason my wife and I didn't have children the old-fashioned way was when I was 1 year old, and I don't remember this. The only reason I know this is because my mom told me. Being always a very active little kid, I was out in the backyard. My mom was, watching me, and what she said was the phone rang, and she turned her back on me for a moment. And in the time that it took her to answer the phone and say whatever, I tried to climb the white picket fence that was between my yard and the neighbor's yard, and I got a hernia for my efforts in my groin. And many, many years later, found out that the tails on my sperm were not working. The heads were fine, I was told, but the tails didn't work. So I remember in the doctor's office when I was finally told this at age 33, I think, I made that very, very regrettable joke. I mean, it may seem funny now, but I regretted saying it as soon as I said it. I said, well, this is stupid. A marathon swimmers can't swim. So that's why we weren't having children that way. I remember telling one or two people that and made a decision very quickly not to tell people that was the reason, but they all had a supplement or the acupuncture was going to work, or I'm a chiropractor and I have many colleagues, and they'd be like, oh, well, if I do this particular adjustment, that'll fix it. And again, I tried a lot of these things, sometimes begrudgingly, sometimes willingly. It just got to a point where it's like, okay, if I ever get a chance to live my life over and go through this again, one thing I know for sure is I'm going to be extremely selective about who I tell I'm going through this with. Because like I say, I'm a reasonably open guy. I do, I'm a bit of a chatterbox, and I do tend to, once I get comfortable with someone, I'm quite happy to talk about and hear about life issues and stories and everything. But that is, in my mind, a mistake that I made, is I was a bit too open about telling people what was happening.
They tend to mean well. Most people do. There are some petty people out there. We all know that. But most people mean well. But
yeah, there's very few people who I think didn't mean well, except for possibly the ones who wanted me to sign me up for their network marketing line. And I will say I don't think they meant well. My actual friends who I had established before this, I'm confident all of them meant well. But the ones who I'd met and, was sort of becoming friends with or just having a conversation with, well, who knows?
Shout out to your profession, because I actually went to a chiropractor yesterday. Kind of off subject. But I feel fabulous. So I'm glad I finally did it.
Well, I'm glad you did too. I mean, I became a chiropractor because I had a severe back injury as a teenager, lost the use of my arms with a severe middle back injury, and was told I'd never be a swimmer again at age 16. And well, at age almost 47, still marathon swimming. Just had my most recent one a few weeks ago. So
the Easter swim.
Yeah. But
that's awesome.
Yeah.
And so remember, guys, that link is in the show notes to the Easter 2022 swim. So I can't wait to check that out myself. And the Clutha River swim, I put a long version and a short version from YouTube in the show notes, because I think the long version is like 53 minutes.
Yeah, that's correct. I made a homemade documentary of my swim down New Zealand's Clutha River. We can get back to childlessness. I'll just quickly say this. One of the ways I moved on from, accepting childlessness was what I've always been doing, was my triathlon and marathon swimming. And when we moved to New Zealand in 2018, I started river swimming. And after I did my first river, which it's called the Waiau River, and for your listeners, that was one of the filming sites for Lord of the Rings. I don't recall the name of the river in the movie, but the main river that was filmed in the original Lord of the Rings movie was on the Waiau River that I swam down. Then I thought, oh, river swimming's great fun. And I came up with the crazy idea of swimming the second longest river in New Zealand, which is the Clutha. It flows from a very wonderful alpine town called Wanaka to the Pacific. It's the second longest, but by far the biggest river in terms of water volume and current strength. And I came up with the idea of that, and I'm not sure what the title is in North America, but I called the harbor master, the people who manage the regional aquatic environments. And I was told swimming the Clutha would be impossible, and only an idiot would try it. And I thought, no, I'm that kind of idiot, so I'll try it. And, well, I did. And that's the conclusion of my book, is describing the Clutha River, not only the swim itself, but particularly on the last day about how I was feeling and my reflections that I did in my life, including childlessness. That was very important to me. And swimming rivers made it very apparent that we're not in control of our life. That's one of the things that I did when I was a teenager. I mean, I started triathlon and marathon swimming before my father went off the rails, but as I was finding my feet in the sport, he really went off the rails, and I felt that by becoming the best triathlete I could be, I was taking control of life. Then, a number of incidents, not just childlessness, but other few hard to deal with incidents that I had in life, started to become aware that at best I've got influence over what happens in life. I wasn't really in control. And what I like about river swimming and, childlessness really made this apparent to me, because as a triathlete and a marathon swimmer, I mean, it's, as I think I alluded to before, one foot or one stroke in front of the other. You eventually get to the finish line. Well, the 5-year process of trying to adopt children in Australia was the longest, I'll call it, race. I mean, I don't mean that literally, but, just as a triathlon analogy, it was the longest endurance event I've ever done by far. And it's the only one that broke me, the only one that caused me to have an absolute meltdown. And I literally had a meltdown in an ultra marathon over childlessness shortly after we pulled the pin on adoption. And I'll come to the reasons we did that shortly. But by swimming down these rivers, and you realize, the river's in charge here. And just for context, the Clutha River, the flow rate is 600 cubics. And what that means is the amount of water going through it is 600 cubic meters of water per second. And what's unique about river swimming as opposed to most other endurance sport is that you don't get to decide when you're doing it necessarily, because if there's either what happens in New Zealand a lot is frequent storms. So the Clutha averages 600 cubic meters of water per second, cubics, and 3 weeks prior, there was a huge flooding event that it went up to 3,200 cubics, and that would have been suicide. And for context, the kayakers stopped kayaking the river at 800 cubics. So I decided, right, if the kayakers stop at 800, that's, for safety considerations, I won't be getting in if it's around there. And it just really highlighted, that I was going with the flow of life. And that's what I imagined as an analogy for river swimming is there's a flow of life. You have a skill set, you do the best you can. And, I have a weird, arguably unpractical skill set for swimming a river because there's a lot to it. Ultimately the river was in control, not me. And that was highlighted in adoption and childlessness and highlighted in these rivers. And that's what I hope to tell in my story.
This is the third time today that I've heard this. As far as you're not in control of your, which we know, we kind of know, but I'm not sure why this is the third time today that I'm hearing this. But this is literally the third time today that I'm hearing that you're not in control, no matter how much. And I think I need to hear that because I tend to be a control freak. Well, just as you so eloquently put it, you're not in control. The river is in control when you're swimming.
And interestingly, if you say control freak, I had that sense when I was quite young, at age 17. I was taking control of my life in an untenable situation of living with an increasingly violent alcoholic. I was taking control of life. And I am in no way a control freak. Like, I mean, the only thing I ever wanted to control was essentially having lots of adventures, both in endurance sport and travel, which, I have done. And I wanted to control life in the sense that I'd have lots of adventures, find lots of love, and meet funny and interesting characters and tell stories and hear stories from all over the world. And that's always what I wanted. But I mean, in terms of control, obviously, like every other issue, it can get completely out of balance. And I think, I never wanted to control a partner. I never wanted to control any colleagues. I have no desire for any kind of power whatsoever other than the powering through the rivers and water and on the roads and trails. That's the only power I want. I think a lot of people who tend to try to control, for example, their partners in various ways or control their colleagues and get into the abusive situation of control. My estimation, having read about it, studied it, thought about it, over lots of miles in the water and lots of miles in my running shoes and bike, I think that they subconsciously have realized they're not in control and they're trying to take back control. And I like to think in my way of, doing triathlons, it was reasonably healthy. But when it gets into controlling people and being abusive towards people, and that's about power and control, it's a lack of control they perceive subconsciously or not. And that's what they're doing. So that's my estimation. And I emphasize I'm not a psychologist. I'm a chiropractor. I've read about this stuff and it makes sense to me.
It does make sense. And I think for my regular listener, they know what I mean when I say I'm a control freak, because I just want life to be okay. Not controlling people, but life. And there's no way you can control life.
In my estimation, life is a series of chaotic events mixed with, calm. And that's one of the things I love about river swimming and marathon swimming is I happen to have a deep love of the water, the ocean, lakes, and rivers. And one of my favorite songs of all time, it became popular when I was a teenager, and it's still to this day. I actually wanted to quote it in my book, but I found out you're legally not allowed to quote songs in books. So yeah, and Garth Brooks never got back to me when I emailed him. I'm sure it was his agent that never got back to me. But the song, "The River," beautiful song, and I've always loved it. But I mean, the lyrics that I really, really resonate with is, "Don't you sit up on the shoreline and say you're satisfied. Choose to chance the rapids and dare to dance the tide." That always resonated to me with as a teenager. And fast forward 30 years, that's what I was literally doing in the Clutha River. His song opens with, something like, "A dream is like a river, ever changing as it flows. And the dreamer is just a vessel that must follow where it goes." And through my journey of triathlon, marathon swimming, and lots of things happened before I met my wife. I didn't meet her till a few weeks before I turned 30. And, I was starting to become aware that I'm on this flowing journey, but not in control. And then when we came to this childlessness, it was so hard to deal with on every level. And then obviously the hardest part was ending up accepting childlessness, but realizing, hey, I have literally no power here. And no matter what I do and no matter how hard I train, no matter how hard I'll use the word fight. It wasn't a fight, but you take my meaning. It's just not up to me. And that was hard to accept.
That's the part that I'm talking about when I talk about control. It's life. And you said it well. It's a life. How did you say it? Life is a series of...
Well, I mean, as far as I can tell, life is inherently chaotic. And I mean, obviously there's calm waters. And I'll come back to rivers. Sections of the Clutha River were extremely calm. And then there was these crazy whitewater rapids, rocks to dodge. And if you hit them, you're in trouble. And sailors say stuff like this, and being an ocean swimmer as well, like life can be like the ocean. You're smooth sailing one moment and you're crashing on the rocks the next, and you don't see it coming. And, a lot of people, especially these days on social media, try to give the illusion of having a perfect life. And it's just, that's definitely not true. I mean, that's it. I think a certain percentage of people have always tried to give the illusion that they've been living a perfect life. It's just easier to project that illusion now in the era of social media, but that's never been true and it never will be true in my estimate.
I agree with that. And speaking of that, in some way, as we come near the end here, I found it interesting how you discuss in the book that couples wait in different ways forward on adoption, and that indeed the stress can split some couples apart. So tell us about how the stress of waiting, how you guys overcame that possibility of splitting, and any tips you can, anyone listening to the audience who may still be trying.
For me, I think that I always had a reasonably good way of dealing with stress. I mean, I had a violent alcoholic father as I was finding my feet in triathlon and marathon swimming. And whenever I found, for me, triathlon and marathon swimming was something I did when I was happy. It was something I did when I was sad. It was something I did when I wasn't really feeling much at all. It was this endurance sport gave me a toolbox, so to speak, of how to deal with life. So for me, I always had that disciplined habit of training and racing and competing and doing some adventures. And my wife, she's extremely creative. She's a writer, and she had published her first book sometime before I wrote mine, and that was one of the things that inspired me to actually sit down and do it. One of the many things we did was we traveled. We decided to go to Mongolia, of all places. We had what we thought at the time would be our last kid-free adventure. We wanted to do something that was wildly outside the box and adventurous. And we went, I used to call it trekking, but since I'd moved to New Zealand, New Zealanders call it tramping, multi-day trek through Mongolia. So that's the sort of thing that we did was we had adventures on our own, and we had our creative endeavors, and we also had these wacky adventures together. So my wife and I have always prioritized, our together time, of course, but something that we found personally is both of us are like this. We need our solo time and we need our together time. For me, it was all about personally, on my solo thing, it was all about the marathon swimming and triathlon, Ironman competition. And together, it was being creative together, and she's more creative than I am. Also, just traveling together, and we do frequent hikes together, frequent bike rides, and we really got heavily into yoga. We took up yoga. We had been doing yoga before I met her, but we really got heavily into it together. In addition to going on this big hiking journey in Mongolia, we went cycle touring in Thailand, and we went to a few yoga retreats both in Australia and in Thailand. So that's how we did it. There are a number of people, both people I've read about and people I've met personally, who, for example, it's not unique to men, but I think it's more common with men. They might throw themselves headlong into their work, and they'll get their work life completely out of balance. And, there are people who do that anyway, but I think a certain number of men who are going through this journey, they think in their mind, it's like, right, I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to save lots of money so that when we have kids, don't have to think about money so much, so that I can spend more time with the kids. But by the time kids come along, if they do at all, we've neglected our partner so much that, okay, there isn't a family at all. And I'd really encourage people who might be going through the journey to not do that and be really conscious of that. I mean, yes, it's a great idea to save money, of course, but not at the expense of ever having a family. Again, that's not unique to men. There are women who do that too. This is just what I've read in the stats and judging by conversations that I had with other couples. And there's a certain percentage of women, again, I recognize I'm a man talking about women, so forgive me in advance if I say something I shouldn't. This is just my observation and also what I read, and also the information the adoption agencies gave us. There's a certain percentage, and again, not all women, who often tend to retreat into their little worlds, and they basically tend to, almost hide from the world. I think more women tend to be ashamed of the fact that they can't bear children for whatever reason, whether it's from infertility from their own side or infertility for the man. In my case, it was me that was infertile. And again, I don't think that's conscious. I don't think they literally go around saying, I'm so ashamed I can't have children. I think that's partly societal pressure, and again, unconscious or not. And I think there's a certain percentage of women that do tend to retreat. And often that retreat is not just from their friends or family. It's often from their partner as well. And they think, okay, everything will be better once we have children. Mm-hmm. And if the day comes where you do have children, and just for example, the man has been, or woman has been working too hard and neglecting their partner, or the woman or the man has been treated too far and neglected the partner. Unfortunately, that's not the best situation. It would be hard to correct your relationship, the added mix of having an adopted child, especially if it's a cross-cultural thing like we tried with intercountry adoption. And if it's an older child, for example, not an infant, like maybe, however old they might be. I mean, if they're capable of language at the time you adopt them, then, there's a whole host of issues you got to deal with there. So if your relationship is not necessarily consciously broken down and you're put in that situation, it's easy to fall into that sort of pattern. Like, I don't think we did that, but I do remember when I first heard about these potential issues, smugly thinking, well, nothing like that will ever happen to us because I, won't let that happen. And at one time, when we were having a really hard night, I think it was after, we found out we weren't going to adopt children from Thailand, before we found out we could potentially adopt from Colombia, which I don't remember if we finished that story. Basically, the reason we didn't end up adopting from Colombia, we were told once that whole process started again and we were accepted, and we were, it would be 12 to 18 months before you had allocated children. Almost exactly 12 months in, we were going to be allocated children, and then a federal judge in Colombia, again, very rightly cited concerns about the terrible corruption within the system and shut it down. So that left us completely out of options. And I would just encourage anyone, if they're thinking or are currently adopting, just really be conscious of making sure you enjoy your non-parent life. And, really just, whatever it was that drew you to your partner to begin with, make sure that you keep nurturing that. And
be intentional. In
yeah. Yeah. And just one thing I wanted to bring up before we conclude, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but is it okay if I just tell the story of that ultra marathon where I had that breakdown?
Yes, I didn't want to give the whole book away, which is why there are certain things I didn't mention. But yes, if you'd like to talk about it, by all means, definitely.
There's a lot in the book I haven't given away. I mean, okay. So I just think, particularly for your listeners, like
yes,
this particular
that story broke my heart.
So basically, we found out that we weren't going to adopt, as I just said, we weren't going to be adopting from Colombia, and that we were living in Adelaide, which is in South Australia at the time. So we decided very shortly after, this is one of the big mistakes that I made, is like we had a big upheaval in our life. We tried to change too much too soon after finding out we weren't having children. My wife's parents live in Brisbane, in Queensland, and her sister also lives there, and she has two young boys. And we thought, okay, we'll be cool aunt and uncle. And I use the word cool very loosely because I'm very much not a cool person in any way, shape, or form, and never have, never will be. But that's kind of what we decided to do. So I sold my chiropractic business, and the process of selling the business was a huge thing. I mean, selling any kind of reasonably successful business can be very stressful in itself. And just as an example, added to that stress, just a few days before the settlement went through, Adelaide is on the edge of the Simpson Desert, which is the Australian outback. So that very, very dry climate. We had this freak storm where we had this huge flood, and my x-ray unit, there's a hole in the roof that I wasn't even aware of. You'd never know because there's so little rain. And I found my x-ray unit being flooded a few days before the settlement went through. So it was just this total disaster. And then so we decided, long before we actually knew that we weren't going to be adopting, I decided I was going to do this ultra marathon in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, which is a short distance outside of Sydney, a beautiful area. So we very stupidly, I was in a very poor state, but I hadn't dealt with it. Then I decided to sell my business, move to Brisbane, take a job that was there. And rather than having like a weekend trip to do this 100-kilometer, which is approximately 60-mile run through the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, we actually went and did this race. Entered this race en route to moving to Brisbane from Adelaide, which is in itself is stupid. And then 2 days before I came down with the flu, I was on the start line completely broken. And the flu was bad. Selling my business was bad. But that honestly was like 2% of it. 98% of it was now on the start line. I started thinking about never going to be a father. And because I hadn't had time to deal with it, with all the stupid things that I did immediately after, finding out we weren't going to have children adopted from Colombia. I've been a triathlete and marathon swimmer, and entering this ultra marathon, I'd never quit a race in my life. And 50 kilometers in, almost exactly halfway in, my body just completely shut down. It just broke down completely. Honestly, I've been in Ironman triathlons and marathon swims where not going well countless times where, you dig deep and you find the strength to keep going, and there was just no chance. And I just had this absolute meltdown at the aid station, and these very kind volunteers were looking after me, and I'm assuming they thought I was having this meltdown because I failed to finish the race. And that was the first time in my racing competitive journey that I honestly couldn't care less about the race. It was all about I was grieving the loss of children that I never even had. The other things, the selling the business and the move and the rest of it was just, like I say, about 2% and the flu. It was just 2% of why I wasn't carrying on. There's no reserves left. I had nothing left in me. And that, as a triathlete and long distance athlete, that was completely foreign territory. And quitting the adoption process was forced upon me, but, giving up realizing there's no way to get to, I'll use the word metaphorical finish line. That was extremely hard to deal with as an endurance athlete.
That, amongst a couple other stories, were pretty heartbreaking as I read the book. So I really would encourage anyone that's listening to check out the book, whether you are a swimmer or a marathoner or not. Honestly, it seems like almost all my episodes this year, and I don't think it was intentional, but they've had a lot to do with health and wellness, physically, mentally, emotionally. So this is going to fit right in for the June 2022 episode. And speaking of that, I did some research on your wife's book, Joyful Eating, and I wondered if it would be okay if I could put a link in the show notes to the book. I was reading, I found it really interesting because she really went there, meaning deep with the whole emotional eating aspect of food.
Yep.
And I'm going to have to get a copy of her book too, but I really, really enjoyed what I did find online and what I read about the book. So hopefully she's okay with me putting that information in the show notes.
She will be. And just on that note, at the risk of very shameless self-promotion, well, wife promotion, Tansy Bogan is her last name. She doesn't share my last name. That book, Joyful Eating, she published that in, if I'm not mistaken, 2019. She has written her first novel. She's actually currently writing her third novel, but the bedtime reading novel version of that book is coming out. I believe it's in June or July. There's a little bit of confusion with the publisher at the moment, but the book is called Weight of a Woman, and it's about a woman going through that, basically the self-help. This book, Joyful Eating, she wrote as a self-help book, but she wanted to get the messages across, for someone who might not read a self-help book or might find that it's heavy reading, or just you only have the habit of reading at bedtime. It can be heavy reading at bedtime. So she wanted to write a novel about that. So that's what this book that will be out in June or July from an Australian publisher, Weight of a Woman. But interestingly, it'll be out, we're hoping, 6 to 10 months from now. The sequel to that book, the same two characters are in that. She actually wrote a sequel, A Childlessness Journey. I wrote Childlessness Journey in my book, factual, but obviously from a man's perspective. And what she decided to do as a very creative person was she decided to use the two characters she had in that book, and in the sequel, which will be called Tears of a Woman, she wrote a fictional account of what happened with us. I mean, it's almost exactly what happened with us, but with fictional characters. So that will be the sequel to that book, and that will be called Tears of a Woman. We're not sure exactly when that's coming out, but we're going to try to get it out as soon as possible. But for those who are interested in the health aspects, Joyful Eating, How to Make Peace with Your Body and Break Free of Diets is her first book, and Weight of a Woman will be out in a few months.
Well, if you can keep me posted on her books, because I do have a list of books in my quote-unquote Childless Not by Choice library on the Facebook page and on the platform, really. So please do keep me posted, and maybe if she would be willing to, I probably shouldn't say it here on the air, but at some point in the future, maybe we can speak with her in an interview format as well. I would love to.
She would love that. I can tell you that, and I'll put you in contact with her.
That sounds fabulous. You guys had me researching raw chocolate, for crying out loud.
Yeah, she even published a children's book just several months ago called Superheroes on the Plate. It's a fun, I won't say nutrition book. It's about encouraging exploratory eating with children. It's not about pushing healthy eating. It's about encouraging kids to have just be creative and explorative on the plate. So her children's book is called Superheroes on the Plate.
I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, I already have a gift in mind for my great nephew. He's going to be 2 in August. So that sounds fabulous. Well, I just want to, as we close out here, thank you so very much again for speaking with us, for taking time out of your early morning to speak with us on this episode. And, that final decision to stop the adoption process, I felt it deep in my heart. But I've got to say again, honestly, the entire book just brought out so much emotion as I read it. And that type of writing takes a lot of talent. So I just want to say kudos to you, Rob, and just any last words before we close things out here.
Well, I mean, I just encourage people to be open about this childlessness community, because as far as I can tell, there's more people who are childless than you might realize. And sometimes it's by choice, sometimes it's not by choice. I think being a man, it's very hard for men to talk about it. And that's one of the many reasons why I wanted to talk to you on this podcast. Is I don't think I'm a stereotypical man. Like, I mean, I have a very open relationship with my wife, and we don't have the issue of me shutting down and not wanting to talk about emotion. But, at the end of the day, I am a boy, so there are male characteristics that I do have. And talking about it through it with her, and now, talking about it openly with you, it's very therapeutic. Like, I mean, I hope your listeners enjoyed it, but this was great for me talking to you. But in my book, I sort of say I've made peace with it. And I don't know that that'll ever be 100% true about being childless, not by choice. My reflections as I was approaching the Pacific in the Clutha River was, reflected over my whole life. But it was very obvious to me that being childless was going to be a scar on my heart for my whole life. But I do think that, overall, I'm a very happy person, and I have pretty crazy and wacky adventures, and just had another one, the marathon swim in Milford Sound over Easter. And then my wife and I went cycle touring for a couple of weeks. We're doing lots of fun things together, and, we're very content and happy. And we have her writing. I'm just starting my second book, and she's on the process of her third novel before the first one's even published. So, so we have all kinds of projects, and I wouldn't say that this is just filler. Like, okay, we didn't get kids, so we're doing all this stuff. Like, I mean, we had these habits established. And I would say, like, if you don't have something that you're passionate about, if children is what you were hoping for and you didn't end up having them for whatever reason, I think one of the key things is finding something you're passionate about. And that could be children related, could be completely unrelated to children. Doesn't matter. Like, if you're passionate about something, that's going to help you move past it. And whether or not you make full peace with it, or I'm going to say 95% peace with it in my case, because I do tend to get emotional when I really get talking about it. One of the things that some people say to me, I realize I'm rambling now as we're trying to conclude, so shut me up when you want me. Some people when you meet new people, and like I moved to a new country at age 42, and I'm now almost 47. Some people will say, when I meet new people, it's like, the question is not, do you have children? It's like, how many children do you have?
Yeah.
And when people find out that I don't have children, I mean, sometimes it's a case of, oh, you selfish person, you should have children. How could you? That sort of thing. And I'm never going to tell my story to someone who comes at me like that.
Oh, yeah.
And occasionally, like if for example, I might have a patient and they're there with their children, and the 7-year-old might be kicking up a tantrum or something like that. And someone might just inadvertently say to me, like, "Oh, you're so lucky you don't have to deal with this crap," and and I think, geez, I'd love to deal with that crap now and again. I mean, obviously, when you're going through the daily grind and you're in the grocery store and your kid's kicking up a fuss and you feel like punting him across the vegetable aisle, you might think, "Oh, geez, it'd be easier if I was just here by myself." But it's just one of those things. That one thing that just happened not that long ago was we had an attempted break-in at our office that the door was almost destroyed, but they didn't get in, and we had to get a new door. And anyway, the girl who had the key, the only key, the first day we had a new door, she went off and didn't realize she had the key in her pocket, and the other two, myself and the other staff member, was there. And, we had to call her and wait for her to come back with the key to lock up. And she just said to me, very blasé and inadvertently, she said, "Well, I have plans with my kids, so I can't be the one to wait for her. You stay." Mm-hmm. And like, I would have offered to stay anyway, but it was as if to say, "Well, my plans with my children are important. You don't have children, so whatever you're planning to do," in which case can't be that important. So, and she didn't think that through, and I don't think she meant it like that. But that's on a day when you're not thinking about childlessness at all, something like that happens, and you're like, "Oh God."
And it's things like this that those of us in the Childless Not by Choice community with a platform, and by the way, you now have a platform with this book. You have a platform in the Childless Not by Choice community as well as in your other community, So just know that going forward. But the thing is, when I hear stories like that, I just think about, oh my gosh, we have so much work to do in society to just, open up people's eyes. And we're all going to stick our feet in our mouths from time to time. But when I hear a story like that, it's just like, oh, come on. Are we still doing that?
Yeah.
That's the best you got?
Yeah. And this has only happened to me once, but, because the infertility issue was on my end as the man,
right.
I know of many men personally, and I'm sure there's untold numbers out there who I don't know personally that, they'll get, particularly from other men. It's like, oh yeah, you're not a real man. You can't even get your girl pregnant. And, I only had that comment once from someone I've only met once in passing. I can't even remember how it came up. So I personally haven't had to deal with that. And like that comment wouldn't faze me because I don't have those macho, manly, stupid issues. I'm just not, we use the word blokey down here in Australia and New Zealand. I don't know if we use that word in North America. My language is a bit messed up having lived in 5 countries. That kind of macho attitude I just have never had. I don't watch football. I don't watch basketball or rugby down here. I'm not into that sort of male life, but I know there are a lot of men, whether they're into that sort of blokey nature or not, they do have to deal with those sorts of comments and insinuations, which is very tough. So that's worth, even though I personally haven't had to deal with that, it's worth mentioning that a great number of men who are in this situation do.
Well, I'm sure this is not the way you wanted to be a part of this community, but I can definitely see that you're a great addition and a great help to the community of the Childless Not by Choice globally. And so I really want to thank you for taking the time. Thank you for the book. You guys, you have to read this book. I'm serious. I'm not just saying it. I mean, even just to hear about the Mongolian trip, which
we won't give that away. We'll let people, anyone who chooses to read it, just know that the book isn't all about childlessness and pushing the body to the limits. There's a lot of crazy, oh my God, how did I get myself into this wacky situation thing? It's about being a goofball as well.
It was hilarious. And then on a sad point, a sad note, the Gibraltar swim. So it's just, the book is awesome. And I just, you did a fantastic job. And I just really want to thank you so much for your time today. And to my listeners, thank you guys so very much for tuning in. I hope you got so much out of this. And I know that a lot of you are women. And so definitely, please, make sure your husbands get a listen to this. It's awesome. It's wonderful. And thank you so much, Rob, for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved it.
You're welcome.